Thanks very much, Libby. So today, I'll take 20 minutes of your time to talk about what we've been doing in Old Crow Flats. And I've talked a lot about this in the last number of years, but I'm going to zoom in on two different types of disturbance in Old Crow Flats, including drain lake basins and permafrost retrogressive saw slumps. Just to give you a little background, Old Crow Flats has about 56,000 water bodies, it has well over 5,000 water bodies within a 56 square kilometer area. The basin is about 15,000 square kilometers, and it's flat because it's the former lake bed of glacial Lake Old Crow that drained about 15 or so thousand years ago. And the lakes are perched above the flow of the river, and so if you have degradation of permafrost, whether it be from overflow of the lakes or headward erosion along the river channels, if you have breaching of those lakes, they can drain out catastrophically. And so the two disturbances, again, that I'll talk about include the lake drainage as well as the permafrost retrogressive saw slumps. And I'm going to just get right into it. And the drained lake story, a lot of it was on the poster that I did for the NASA Above meeting that we just had. So I'm going to get through that pretty quickly because I've got some really new data to show you regarding the saw slumps. So lake drainage events have been increasing in Old Crow Flats. And this is not news. We published this paper a few years ago. And so we're interested in knowing how do these limnological or ecological conditions respond to drainage events so that we can understand what the implications are for increasing frequency of drained lakes. And also, we've got a drained lake, double lake, that we saw draining back in 2007. And ever since, we've been taking water samples and analyzing it for water chemistry as well as water isotope tracers to understand how the hydrology has responded since drainage. And in that time, long story short, there's been a lot of encroachment of vegetation. You can see in that photograph for June 2017. This has changed the hydrology of the lake, and I'll show some data on that. But the point is that we can use this basin that is undergoing a great deal of greening and shrub encroachment to provide a general model for how lakes respond to catchment greening. And we know that greening is occurring in a lot of places across the Arctic, so that provides some motivation for the research. So just what I had to do was utilize the Landsat and Sentinel record to monitor the spatial extent of Zelma Lake since it drained, and where UAV data came in, so that was part of my title. I'm utilizing remotely piloted aircraft systems, RPAS, or unmanned aerial vehicles for this. And so what that data did was provided some ground truth information so that I could train the Landsat pixels for coming up with land cover classifications, as well as the average data for land cover classifications of the lake basin, so we know how land cover changed. And I also used it to constrain the extent of the water body so that we could see how the water level fluctuated over that time, and coupled that with some smoothing to try to get the most out of the Landsat to track the surface water area changes. And then we use that in conjunction with the water chemistry and water isotopes to understand how the change in hydrology is affecting the hydroecology of the lake. So this is one of the final figures. And this is a paper that I submitted about a month and a half ago to Arctic Science. We have, obviously you can see in those maps, you have a greening going on starting in 2007, immediately after it drained. You can see there's the mud flat in 2007, and then it gets greener and greener. And then the light green are inundated areas where you have overlap of the detected water and the vegetation. If you go down to the graph and zoom in on the red line, that is the water isotope data. And it is generally increasing. Now, if you do Mann-Kendall trend analysis, it is actually increasing over time, and that's because it is actually getting more input into the lake, which is offsetting the effects of evaporation. So it's greening, and it's getting more input into the lake. Now, if we apply the average data and a little bit of Landsat, you can see how it's a little pixelated at the top. We didn't have average data covering the whole basin, but what I did is I just kind of put a Landsat hat on top of it and then did a land cover classification using, again, like I said, the UAV data to train the Landsat pixels. And the biggest part of this story is that willow vegetation increased by just under 31% within the entire former lake bed. So that's a considerable amount of vegetation change. And so obviously that has implications for the hydrology and the chemistry for that. So if we so if we take that data, the 30%, and some snow data, which tells us that willow on average gets about 2.5 centimeters more snow water in it than open land cover, which it would have been if it was a lake. We apply those two together, and we're getting for 2017 93,000 cubic meters more water into the lake. What does that mean? Well, if you can relate it to swimming pools, that's 37 Olympic swimming pools. The point is, there's more input getting into the lake because of the vegetation. So that's useful information. And what does that do to the water chemistry? This is a principal components analysis, and it looks like a pretty noisy figure, and that is because Velma became, after it drained in 2007, you can see its point up there where the water is continuous on that map. As soon as it drained for the next few years, it bounced all over the place with high nutrients, high ions, very dynamic, very reliant on the meteorological conditions. It got eutrophic, and oxygen levels are quite low. And then after we picked up water chemistry analysis again around 2016, we can see that green line in the middle. That is representing a more stabilized chemical regime for Zelma Lake compared to that red line that's bouncing all over the place. So with that increased input getting into the lake, it's actually stabilized the hydroecology of the basin. So it's a different water body, or it's a different kind of water body now. It's not going to make its way back up to where 2007 is in terms of the water chemistry, because it's just got much greater proportion of terrestrial land cover now. So that's the story of Zelma Lake, and now the ongoing research is to apply that to a grander scale and maybe get a sense of how other basins are responding during the same time frame. Okay, getting to permafrost retrogressive thaw slump. Sorry, the last figure I have to do for this draft that I'm almost ready to submit is the actual site map. But this is along the Old Crow River. This retrogressive thaw slump was initiated during June 2016, and we started doing UAV surveys of it a month later, and have 5 different surveys up to spring 2019. So it's about, in this photo, it's about 90 meters across, parallel with the river, and about 35 meters above the flow of the river, down where it outflows into that solifluction lobe. Here's some data regarding how much it changed in that time period. you can see in the map that the area changed considerably, going from about 6,000 meters square to over 10,000, and it just increased a little bit into 2019 again. The volume, we can zoom in on two intervals in particular, summer 2017 and summer 2018. There was a greater increase in volume exported during 2017 than 2018. And we're using that data in addition to the carbon data that we're getting from sediment samples to model how much carbon is then being exported to the river, which is made available for mobilization within the aquatic environment. And we've gone through additional analysis, which is telling us some other really interesting things. But first off, just comparing those 2 years, so the red line represents how much sediment was exported from the slump over the entire study, and we can see the two jumps are 2017 and 2018. In 2017, the volume exported was about 8,200 cubic meters versus much less than 2018. Now, 2017 was much warmer, and it was actually, there was less rain during 2017, but the rain events were concentrated on 2 to 3 day time periods. And so instead of it being spread out over the month, there was 3 events that lasted 2 days, and that was enough to get the evacuation happening and sediment moving out of the slump and into the river. Oh, and you can see that when you include the carbon data, we can model how many tons of carbon. So in 2017, we'd expect during that time period from the slump, 131 tons being exported versus 109 during 2018. Now, I'm trying to get the most out of the UAV data within the slump, and I'm coming up with some pretty interesting data products here that I can use in conjunction with the carbon data to understand the different geomorphological components of the slump and how that affects carbon flux. So we've got 4 different products here. The 2 on the top are derived from just a digital surface model. So if you have like a red, green, blue camera and you take overlapping images of an object, you can use photogrammetry and structure from motion to come up with a digital surface model. And then you can model things like this hillshade and this irradiance. Irradiance is the amount of solar radiation getting onto the surface. And so we can see the more red zones. That's where there's more intense sun radiation during, and I modeled it for summer solstice, June 20th, 2019. And we can see the darker areas where it's shaded. So that part of the slump isn't getting as much radiation. And then down in the lower part, we have NDVI from the multi-spec data and also thermal data. Now, first off, if we just consider irradiance, we can see that the most headwall ablation, or the most retreat within the slump occurred on the north side of it. It's getting the most direct sunlight. The sun is at an angle of about 45 degrees during summer solstice, and in the mid-afternoon it's shining directly at that slope. So orientation has something to do with it, in addition to the massive ice, of course. So we can see that transect 7 that is getting a lot of that high irradiance. That's where these are changes in elevation profiles for each of these transects over the course of the entire study. We can see that if you just look at panel 7, that transect has experienced the greatest headwall retreat, and that's in the direction of the most intense sun, and there's also ice wedges there. So irradiance is something that needs to be considered, I think, on a grander scale, and we should take a look at a lot of the slumps that are out there, how they're oriented according to the sun. And there has been some work done here, but there's also been some studies looking at many slumps, hundreds. And I think it would be interesting to go back to some of those data sets to look and see how the slumps are actually oriented relative to the dominant sun angle. I think it might help us understand how slumps will, once they've formed, how they will continue to develop given their retrogressive nature. Now, there's it. Easy. So if we go back and we take the irradiance data, the multi-spec data, the thermal data, what I've found is it can grab different parts of, or different geomorphic components of the actual slump, because it's highlighting where there's shade, where it's more moist. That's down in the southwest area. And then you can see the brown patches. That is more moist soil, but it's where the high irradiance is. And that it maintains its high moisture because that is a lower lying, low slope sort of drainage pathway where the mud slurries make their way out of the slump during evacuation events. And that's compared to the yellow areas, which are raised, dry clay areas that they have ridges on them, which are highlighted by a flow accumulation model, which is those red lines along them. The yellow portions, they erode over time, but they're not part of the mass wasting events. They're not moving themselves as a whole. What I'm finding is that they stay pretty stationary throughout the entire life cycle of this slump. But you've got this other almost conveyor belt geomorphic zone where you've got evacuation-prone sediment that is pulling sediment from these higher ridge areas and for the most part from the head wall, which is retreating. So you've got three different geomorphic components regarding the sediment, and then you've got the old vegetation in the swamp that moves around the whole thing in green, depending on whether or not there's an evacuation event. So again, this product is sort of an exploratory product that's from maximum likelihood classification using the thermal data, the multi-spec, and the irradiance model. Now, also along perpendicular to the dominant flow direction of the slump, we've got transects set up where we took 28 sediment samples, and we're looking at the carbon and nitrogen percent. And if you just look at the dry, the areas from the dry land cover, that's land cover class 3. They have the lowest percent carbon and nitrogen when you compare that to the areas that are shaded, which are land cover classification 2. And one of the running questions are, so once you have sediment that thaws, how long does it take to either go to the atmosphere as methane and carbon dioxide versus being mobilized to the aquatic environment? And I'm wondering if these geomorphic zones that we've identified are actually influencing that carbon cycling. And so that's the ongoing question. And it would be really interesting to see if ABRIS data can help or maybe be used or is high enough resolution to get at these different geomorphic zones within the slump and provide some information on the actual carbon cycling in addition to the ground truth information that we have. So anyways, just to sum it up, we have drained lakes. We have ongoing monitoring, which will help us understand how the implications of increased frequency of drained lakes. And we have this working model of how lakes respond to pressure change, like greening. And the main conclusion that we have from our data is that the hydrology and the chemistry is quite unstable following drainage, but then has settled down during recent years, but is a completely different hydroecological regime than it originally was. Regarding the permafrost retrogressive thaw slumps, we have greater sediment export during hot weather and more intense rainfall events, even if average rainfall is lower. over the course of the summer. The orientation relative to the sun is an important factor in addition to the location of massive ice and for determining how much headwall retreat is going to occur. And we have products from the UAD data that can help highlight some of the geomorphic components that are influencing the development of the swamp as well as the chemical properties, including carbon flux. So next steps, I'd like to see how AVERS data could be used with this. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kevin. We now have a few minutes if people have questions for Kevin about his presentation. Everyone should be able to unmute themselves and or if they want to chat, write something in the chat section, they can do that too, and then we'll be able to answer those.
I find it very interesting the fact that you were able to really identify the effect or the importance of the extreme, like intense precipitation events on these degradation rates. In 2014, maybe you know that, but in 2014 we had also crazy precipitation events. Not only in terms of the intensity, but also overall, like the fall precipitation regime was very high. So you had both the very high amount of precipitation, but also these very extreme events of very intense precipitation. And then winter came, and in 2015, in the Gulf Stream Valley, at least, and the Canada Flats, a lot of thermal erosions and thermokarst got initiated. It hasn't been quantified across the landscape, or it is in the process of being quantified across the landscape, but it was very likely associated also with these very intense precipitation events.
Yeah, that's a lot. That's what a lot of well, some of the studies from Canada, like the Northwest Territories, there's a number of studies that have shown that the rainfall intensity is really a main driver of those mass wasting events.
Any other questions for Kevin?
If I could just say that, so we weren't able to get to the field this year. It would have been really interesting, obviously, to get another year of data for all of this. But the plan is to be back at least the next couple of years. That's at least that's when the funding for this original project of mine goes till. So point that out. And I'd also like to thank the many people in OCRO that have helped support the research. They've been quite welcoming, and I'm honored to work with them in their traditional territory.
Thank you, Kevin. Okay, well, let's switch over then to Hélène. Next we have Hélène Genet, who is from University of Alaska Fairbanks at the Arctic Institute of Biology, and I think she should be able to, let's see if I can do this, make her a presenter. And you should be able to share your screen. Yes, we are starting to see that now. And just a reminder for folks in case there are any new people on the line, we are recording this, so the recording will be hosted on the above website. And after Hélène's presentation, we will have time for some questions. Or you can also type a question in the chat window. So.
All right. You can, okay, and I do that. Okay.
Perfect.
Can you see? Okay. Right, and I'd like to, let's see this, just a second. No, that doesn't work. Okay, that's fine. Yeah, so from Kevin scale, we're going to go to the state of Alaska. Because so this large scale analysis is across the entire state. It's a regional analysis, but it can be applied, and you see across, you see while I present the results that it applies to the Yukon territories and that this continuous permafrost zone. So the topic of the talk today is the consequences of permafrost on soil moisture, and what can we learn from long-term monitoring, and in that case, in situ long-term monitoring. So this is a project that ignore the order here. We are all leading the study, but I'm conducting Hélène, Genet, and then Heather Griggs, who is a postdoc extraordinaire in our team, who has done an amazing job in getting those data and QA/QCing them, etc. And Neil Pastic from USGS, who's bringing the AI and analytical tools, or is going to, in that analysis. That analysis is ongoing, so the results that I'm going to present today are not final, but are pretty exciting. Okay. Okay, so we don't need that introduction, but yeah, so there is a warming amplification in the high latitude ecosystems, mainly in the permafrost zone, inducing both vertical thaw of the permafrost as well as lateral degradation of the permafrost. Models basically project that by 2300 we'll lose about 91% of the permafrost domain, the permafrost extent, which represents about 13 million square kilometers. Although you can see that there is a certain uncertainty among models, and in the trend is consistent among all models. So in response to warming, permafrost is dying. These models represent a vertical thaw of the permafrost, and that's what I'm going to talk also in this presentation. I'm not going to talk about what Kevin studied, which is permafrost lateral degradation, like thermokarst features or thermal erosion. So this is for next talk. I was hoping to talk about that today, but not enough time. So just as a side note, we are putting together a model to use data, the type of data that Kevin is collecting in the field and other data coming out from the literature and our own field work to predict where thermokarst will occur and what effect it will have on land cover and carbon dynamics. But this is for another talk. Okay, soil moisture. Yeah, so as permafrost thaw vertically, it will very likely affect the hydrological regime, because permafrost exerts a strong control on soil hydrologic conditions, acting as a barrier to vertical water infiltration. So this beautiful schematic here is from that very hot paper just coming out of the press from Anderson and Al. That is a model intercomparison, same as the one that I showed here, but focus on moisture.
Check where the
yeah, here is a graph of the same models that I showed before in that permafrost time series, the same time period. But this is the trend in soil moisture as these models are predicting them. And so overall, if you follow the black line here, the black line is the mean across all these models. You can see that the general mean is towards drying of the soils as permafrost thaw, basically. And that mean decrease is about 10% of near surface soil moisture for the permafrost region that will decrease by 2300. But as you see here, the uncertainty is large. And this is because we don't know much about the fate of hydrological regimes, as permafrost and active layer, permafrost stable and active layer depends in response to warming. And this is what motivated our synthesis effort, because as it's likely that permafrost is exerting an important effect on soil moisture in return is a big control. Soil moisture and hydrological regime in general are exerting a large control on Arctic carbon exchange. The amount of carbon that's going to be decomposed and the nature of that carbon. The more anaerobic conditions you get, the more methane is going to be emitted. Even if the total amount of carbon would decrease, because methane has a larger warming potential than CO2, its effects on the climate might be substantial. So we put it together as a synthesis. At the beginning, we were very, very ambitious, and we thought, we're going to synthesize all the in-situ soil moisture records for the circumpolar region. And we started with that, and very early on, it appears that the quality and the resolution of the both vertical and temporal resolution of these in-situ measurements vary greatly across the circumpolar region. So we thought, well, in the process, we're going to maybe first start with what we know best, which is Alaska. So we synthesized existing in-situ soil moisture measurements across Alaska to characterize the spatial temporal patterns of variations and identify the environmental drivers of soil moisture across the landscape. The questions we specifically focus our analysis on are detecting long-term trends of soil moisture, assessing how these trends are varying across space and time, and of course, assessing or trying to understand what are these environmental drivers that are potentially controlling these trends. So after months of data handling and Heather Greaves came up with that beautiful data set, to my point of view at least, that gathered 178 sites for in-situ soil moisture across Alaska. And if you sum up all the years across all the sites, it's totaled 1,500 years of measurements. A little more than that. And so you can see here a map of these sites. So you can see different symbols overlap one another because we didn't focus only on soil moisture because we wanted to also identify potential environmental drivers. We also looked at snow depth measurements, precipitation, air temperature, soil temperature, active layer depth, etc. And so these are all these different symbols overlap on top of one another on the soil moisture sites. And so the variable that we found the most often along with the soil moisture was soil temperature for 167 sites, and then to a lower extent air temperature, precipitation, and snow depth. So the analysis that I'm going to present today is mainly using these in-situ observations. We are now trying to integrate model estimates of temperature and precipitation in sites where we don't have in-situ observations and so on. So we are continuing to develop that database at the moment as we speak. But all the in-situ data are collected and synthesized and QA/QC'd. We added also on top of those information, ancillary information, mostly from when available from metadata along with the soil moisture reports, but that was not, metadata didn't always indicate it, for instance, plant cover, elevation slope, never active layer, and never permafrost distribution. So we got that from, so the active layer was assessed from site temperature because the calm grids didn't overlap exactly the soil moisture site, so we set those aside and we estimated active layer from soil temperature. In sites where we didn't have land cover, we estimated from the NSCD or from the Alaska Conservation Center, and I can't remember the S, but that's land cover map. And net for the elevation and slope. So anyway, this is a brief presentation of the database as it is now. And these very messy graphs here represent the soil moisture, weekly soil moisture, and the blue shades represent the latitude of the site and different depth bin, because soil moisture in a lot of the sites were measured at different soil depths. And we gathered the soil depths by 20 centimeter increments, so 0 to 20 centimeters is the top graph, and then 20 to 40 centimeters at the bottom, and 40 to 60 centimeters the lowest graph. And you can see in the lowest graph, the deepest horizon, you don't see this very light, very northernmost sites, simply because the UV permafrost. But anyway, an interesting thing here, you can see this very pronounced seasonal patterns in the northernmost sites that freeze all the way in the winter and then until in the summer. And you'll have also that very strong effect of the snow melt on the moisture. We defined 3 seasons, but because we are interested only in soil moisture in broad horizons, and because we didn't have snow data, we based the definition of our early season, late season, and mid-season on both soil moisture and soil temperature and air temperature. With the early season being the 3 weeks following the first week where you have positive air and soil temperature. Late season being the 3 weeks before the last week of the year where you have positive air and soil temperature. And the mid-season is anything in between. All right. So before we talk about the exciting stuff, we had to look at the effect of the method, so the instrument that was used to collect soil moisture, and also the source of the data. And both of those had a significant effect on the magnitude of the soil moisture data. So we had to take that into account, and basically we centered the soil moisture data on their annual means so that we keep the seasonal pattern and we keep the long-term trend. Sorry for taking so much time on that, but I think it's important to mention for people who are interested in data homogenization and metadata, etc. Yeah, we are here. There are a lot of data out there. Most of them are very well documented, but there is also a significant part that is not necessarily very well documented, and that would yeah, so that's there is progress to be done there. Okay, long-term trends. We base our long-term trend estimates on an 8 years window, moving window. 8 years was based on a cutoff value where we decided looking at the distribution of the length of the time series. 8 years was, yeah, a way to maximize our data. So, the colors here, the red represent drying trends, and the blue represent wetting trends of soil moisture. The y-axis is the latitude, so the top of the graph are more northward, and the bottom southward. And then the sides of the dots represent the slope, the importance of the trend, the magnitude of the trend. And then each columns represent early season, mid-season, and late season, and each row represents a depth gain. So what you can see overall is that you have drying trends and wetting trends going on at the same time. But overall, if you look from far away, the red is kind of dominating. Even if you have some sites that are significantly wetting, or even some soil horizons that are significantly wetting, overall it's mostly drying. And when you sum up or average all these trends across the landscape and time, you get a negative number. But yeah, so an important information also here is that it seems that the trends varying from between depths and also between seasons, with the largest trends occurring probably during the early season, where the red and the blue is the most sharp. Okay, and these trends, these increasing, so wetting trends or drying trends, are slightly increasing over time, over the past 2 decades, in terms of their magnitude, which I found also interesting. So let's dive into trying to understand what all this variability is all about. So first, when you look at those trends and stratify them by permafrost zones, so here the continuous permafrost zones is basically the Arctic, where the entire area is underlaid by permafrost. The discontinuous zone is more of a boreal region, where you have places where you have permafrost and places where you don't have permafrost, but overall the majority is permafrost, and then isolated permafrost zones where permafrost is much scattered. You can see that in areas where permafrost is discontinuous or isolated, the drying trend is dominating. When you look at the continuous permafrost regions, there is actually no real dominance of wetting or drying trends. So overall, it seems that permafrost seems to influence those soil moisture trends, which is what we thought. Good. But then I was kind of surprised by this. So I went a little deeper and looked at how these box plots were looking like by depth gain, so vertically. And sure enough, in that continuous permafrost, you have a good stratification of soil moisture where the trends. So where in the upper horizons, the ones that are the most distant from the permafrost table, you have drying trends. And the closer you go to the permafrost table, the wetter the soil horizons become. This stratification by depth is much less clear in the discontinuous and isolated permafrost zones. But overall, each combination of permafrost zones and depth had a significant drying or wetting trends, except for this guy here, the 0 to 20 centimeter depth gain in the discontinuous permafrost zones. Okay, moving on because time is passing. So I tried to get a little closer to what a model would look like and took advantage of our air temperature, precipitation data, and all our ancillary data. And after doing a bunch of models, I'm going to present that one, which basically associates soil moisture changes with air temperature changes, precipitation changes, elevation, permafrost probabilities. This was a great permafrost probability map put it together by Neil passed it in 2015, I think, and the slope of the site. I use that data set, I ran a boosted regression tree with a learning rate of 0.005 and a fraction of 0.5. What did I forget to mention? That's pretty much it. Okay, good, right on time. So this is what we ended up with. So the results. So if you are not used to look at those type of graphs, basically the y-axis, that's fitted function, the magnitude here is the soil moisture trend. Okay, so with drying at the bottom and wetting at the top. And then the x-axis are the different drivers that I looked at. So air temperature change, elevation, permafrost, probability, slope, and precipitation change. I'm going to go back here. Overall, the most important driver was air temperature and then elevation. The lowest influence was exerted by changes in precipitation, which I was surprised about. Yeah, but so overall, when you look at those data here, the drying trends are mostly associated with decreasing precipitation and draining conditions, so high elevation here and higher slopes here. As you can see here, elevation was kind of a good influence, slope not so much. This is something we are struggling with. We are trying to really dig into the metadata to really get a good sense of what the drainage conditions are. And Neil is extracting also additional remote sensing data so we can characterize the draining conditions a little better. So this is really initial results. And the wetting trends are associated with warming, the presence of permafrost here, and poor drainage in general, so lower elevation and lower slopes. And the slopes here are important. Okay, conclusion. So the general trend of soil moisture over the past few decades is overall a decreasing trend. So soil moisture is, soils are getting drier over time. But as you can see, there is also places that are getting wetter, and and so these drying trends are dominating in interior Alaska. The Yukon River Basin, I wouldn't be surprised, would be dominated by drying trends. Soil moisture trends in the continuous permafrost zone suggest that the trend is influenced by the depth of the permafrost, and this is something we're investigating right now. Drying trends are associated with decreasing precipitation, makes sense, and high drainage conditions, so upland types of area. When trends are of soil moisture is increasing in places that are warming and that present cold drainage conditions. Thank you. If you have questions, please share. Oh, if you have data to contribute, please share.
Thank you very much, Hélène. Yes, so if anyone has any questions for Hélène, please feel free to unmute yourself or write something in the chat box, and we can have a brief discussion about that.
Hi, Hélène. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Fanny. Yeah,
Thanks. That was really super interesting. I was just curious if you've done any analysis based on soil types, like whether you're taking a measurement in like organic soils or lush or gravel or that kind of thing. It seems like that's an important factor.
Yes. Heather was able to find I can't remember, but a significant proportion of the sites where we have organic layer thickness. And then from Thor Jorgensen's, from the surface of geology, we can kind of assess the type of soil cities or stratification cities at a very coarse scale. And both of them have a significant effect. Eolian and coastal deposits having drying trends. Wetting trends are non-significant across the number, but fluvial deposits, which are characterized by these more coarse textures, definitely have drying trends. Organic layer thickness, I'm looking at it right now, so it's ongoing, but it's a very good suggestion. We are looking at that.
Hélène, is the Arctic DEM being used at all to enhance models of drainage conditions at all?
Yes, it's not included in the database now, but yeah, Nipaltic is gonna look at this data, and I think we already had extracted them. It's a matter of including them in the database. Yeah. Yes. But the thing too, I forgot to mention about, because this is something, I mean, looking at those data and developing this database, which is something that I never really did before to that scale. There is so much data out there that are now publicly available, but the metadata are the things that really needs to be improved. For instance, we have great DMs out there right now. We have the ISA data and so on. But a good portion of the sites, we have 30 coordinates. So it's frustrating. For some of the sites, we were not able to really take advantage of those very fine resolution observations, just because we don't have very accurate coordinates of the site. We are trying to, so Heather is contacting each data provider individually to try to get at better coordinates. For some of them, they were able to provide better coordinates than what is publicly available. But, any other questions?
Well, it sounds like there are no further questions, and we're just over 3 o'clock. I want to thank Kevin and Hélène for their presentations and remind everyone that the recording will be posted on the above website. If you are interested in presenting or know someone who maybe could give an interesting, relevant talk, please feel free to have them contact me and let me know, and we can get something set up. For another one, we have some other presentations in the works for the fall, and I really appreciate everybody joining us for this time. And with that, thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, Libby, for organizing.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Libby.